Andreas Krieg is an associate professor at the School of Security Studies in King's College in London, and he joins us now live from London. One thing that is missing here, Andreas, if the U.S. is preparing for a prolonged military conflict in this region, is there are no ground troops to be seen so far. How does that play into how this is going to unfold?
This is the ultimate weakness and vulnerability of this entire U.S. strategy. If indeed we are going down a regime path, a path of regime change, as Trump suggests in his speech this morning, then there is this key element missing. So the Israelis think that they can mobilize a very alienated, aggrieved Iranian population to take action against their own regime. I don't see any way that can actually happen because there isn't a coherent, consolidated opposition. There aren't any arms or weapons that are being distributed at a large scale. So basically, this is a remote standoff, air power-led campaign that can maybe lead to degradation, but actually without seizing ground and holding it, there is no way the regime is just going to collapse and disappear. And so this is kind of where the Americans will run out of steam once target lists have been exhausted, which can likely come in a few days.
And there is something difficult about an operation that is solely focused on regime change also. There is a lot of moving parts here now, as you mentioned there and alluded to, that inside Iran, the U.S. and Israel have no control over. So how do you ensure that those go according to plan now?
All the courses of action that have been presented to the president, to Trump over the last couple of weeks were imperfect, suboptimal. The reason that we had nearly a month of hesitation of striking or not striking had to do with the fact that the Joint Chiefs of Staff made it quite clear to the US president that there isn't an easy way in, easy way out, and at the same time feasible, successful, and sustainable course of action on the table. And that's kind of part of the problem. What is the strategy of this campaign? And if the strategy is regime change, how can it actually be implemented? I mean, if we look at the different targets that have been struck now, it seems that the Americans focusing mainly on missile and missile production, which is one of the issues that are not on the negotiation table. So should there be any off-ramp in the coming weeks to return to the negotiation table, the Americans could then say, we can negotiate a nuclear deal because we've destroyed the ballistic missile program. But the Israelis at the same time are pushing a very much wider campaign, which I think is completely fantasy land, of saying we're trying to change the regime. We call all the Iranians to step up and take action and replace this regime. That's unlikely going to happen. And so this is in many ways a very, very flawed war based on flawed assumptions and a flawed strategy.
But if one of the goals, as you say, is to potentially force Iran back to the table on a number of other issues, how likely could that possibly be now, given that this is now the second time that Iran has been negotiating with the U.S. and in the middle of those negotiations has been hit with strikes?
It's very, very low, the probability right now. There's no way that Iran is just going to come around. And I think the president has to understand this. And it must have been made clear by the Omani foreign minister visiting Washington yesterday. The Qataris have been obviously in constant close conversation with the Americans, made it very clear there is no way that once you escalate, you can just turn the key as you did in June last year, to just create an off-ramp diplomatically. And so it must be very clear to the president that the Iranians are not just going to return without actually getting something significant, immediate. And I think the regime now has already preparing for the last, since probably beginning of the year, preparing and dug in for a protracted conflict. And ultimately time, I think, plays on the side of the regime, while it will be very difficult for the US to sustain this campaign for weeks and weeks on end, considering that they only have 2 carrier strike groups and then basically have to use Israel as the forward operating base, because the airspaces and air bases in the Gulf are basically off limits for the US Air Force. So it's not an easy campaign to endure and sustain.
In your estimation, how would Iran have been using that time, as you mentioned, if they have been looking at this since the beginning of the year and thinking that these strikes were imminent? What do you do with that time?
So the Iranian regime is not a hierarchical regime where decapitation is even on the table. So if you were to kill the supreme leader or even the line of succession, which is, I think, what the Israelis are trying at the moment, trying to take out operational and strategic commanders across the IRGC, theocratic leaders, political leaders, it doesn't mean that the regime is just going to collapse in. The fact is that what we've seen since January is that we have a complete decentralization of the chain of command and control. And so we see that despite this heavy attack this morning, there is no paralysis in Iran. Iran is sustaining it. We're very quick to actually fight back, to strike back across the Gulf, escalating, and the operational tempo is there. And that shows also that C2 command and control has been completely delegated to the local level. And we also see that the Basij, for example, which is the major component of the IRGC that controls the public on the ground, basically they organize, they have been on alert for quite some time, and they organize themselves on the local level without having to rely constantly onto the major chain of command in Tehran. And so that, again, we have to think about the Iranian regime as an organization, a system that looks a lot more like an insurgency group, and thereby being able to sustain pressure than it looks like a normal hierarchical state.
Andreas, Krieg, we appreciate you joining us from London on this breaking news.